Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the anniversary of the horrific October the 7th attacks, I again repeat the call for the immediate release of all hostages. And in light of Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza, the violence in the West Bank and the invasion of Lebanon, I asked the Prime Minister if he believes that Israel's right to self-defense justifies a death toll, according to research by US medical professionals who have worked in Gaza, has now surpassed 118,000, as well as the 2,000 people killed in Lebanon. And will he do what is morally and legally right and end the government's complicity in war crimes by banning all arms sales to Israel, including F-35 fighter jets, not just 30 licenses, yes or no?
The tragedy of the deaths a year ago have now been compounded by tens of thousands more deaths in Gaza, the West Bank and in Lebanon. Gaza is now reduced to a place of rubble and famine and thirst and premature death, and lots of children looking for their families. The bombs that have rained down on Gaza and other places are in part supplied by this country. The International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have both made very strong opinions on the whole situation there. Will the Prime Minister revisit the whole situation of the sale of British arms that are being used to bomb Gaza and kill wholly innocent Palestinian civilians?
Mr. Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, as we remember all those killed in the 7th of October Hamas attack and all those killed day after day in Israel's war on Gaza and now Lebanon, the case for peace and the preservation of human life and the protection of human life has never been more urgent and compelling. An immediate ceasefire is desperately needed to stop all the killing, end the war crimes, free the hostages and get the aid into Gaza. But it's clear Israel's right-wing political leaders will keep rejecting ceasefires and keep violating international law without stronger international pressure. So, to get Israeli leaders to back a ceasefire, don't we need to see tougher action, including an end to all arms sales, as recent international court rulings demand?
Prime Minister.
Look, I completely agree that we need an immediate ceasefire, and that is what we're working with. It's what the US in particular is leading on. I don't agree with a complete ban on arms sales. That, Mr. Speaker, would include a ban on arms being used for defensive purposes. Looking at the attack of only a few days ago by Iran, I think the House will understand my position on this and the position of many across the House.
Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has rightly spoken about the significance of diplomacy right now, and I think this entire House would agree that across the region itself, leaders must come together. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what discussions has he had with GCC leaders, the leadership across the GCC, about the behaviour, the aggressive behaviour of their neighbour, Iran, and what role they can play in the de-escalation and preventing Iran from further escalating this terrible conflict?
Prime Minister.
I thank you for that question. This is a really important issue. We have had numerous discussions with our colleagues and with leaders, and I do think there's an important role that can be played and pressure that can be put through those discussions, and we will continue to do so. So I thank her for her question.
Dr. Rupert Huck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Among those killed in the horrors of October the 7th were children, with a number still held hostage to this day. And in Gaza since, a grisly new acronym, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family, to add to the child death toll, which is now 2 mounting in Lebanon. Would my right honourable friend press for the protection of children as a priority in his ceasefire advocating and humanitarian efforts? And would he agree that no parent should ever be burying their child?
Prime Minister.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And whether it's children taken as hostages, it hardly seems possible to say that sentence without recoiling, or those orphaned in Gaza, she rightly suggests. Thank you.
Sir Julian Lewis.
I appreciate that it's difficult to get into the mind of a theocratic regime such as the Ayatollahs in Iran, but to what extent has the government been able to establish whether a principal motivation for what happened on October the 7th was the desire of the Iranian regime to prevent a rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, its great rival.
Prime Minister.
Look, Iran bears huge responsibility across the region, both in their assistance in relation to the October the 7th attack and through the other action that they are supporting in the region. And that is why we've been very clear in our positioning on Iran and very clear about the responsibility that Iran bears in relation to these awful incidents.
Zara Sultan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the anniversary of the horrific October the 7th attacks, I again repeat the call for the immediate release of all hostages. And in light of Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza, the violence in the West Bank and the invasion of Lebanon, I asked the Prime Minister if he believes that Israel's right to self-defense justifies a death toll, according to research by US medical professionals who have worked in Gaza, has now surpassed 118,000, as well as the 2,000 people killed in Lebanon. And will he do what is morally and legally right and end the government's complicity in war crimes by banning all arms sales to Israel, including F-35 fighter jets, not just 30 licenses, yes or no?
Minister.
No. But it is a really serious point. Banning all sales would mean none for defensive purposes.
F-35 fighter jets.
None for defensive purposes on the anniversary of October the 7th, and days after a huge attack by Iran into Israel would be the wrong position for this government, and I will not take it.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly pointed out that the conflict in the Middle East has been manipulated and sponsored by the Iranian regime, and we should stand by Israel, who is bearing the burden, taking the risks and standing up to world opinion in taking on Iran and its proxy terrorist groups. But can he tell us what part can our government play in putting pressure on the Iranian regime, and why is it that the Revolutionary Guards, who are sponsoring much of this terrorism, can still operate freely in London?
Prime Minister.
Can I agree with him? We must stand by Israel and be absolutely clear about Israel's right to defend herself, particularly at this time of escalation by Iran. I think in relation to his question about the Iranian regime, we have to be really clear that we stand with Israel. We have to be really clear in condemning Iran, and we have to do that with our allies with one voice, so that the message is heard very, very powerfully. Thank you.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, I associate myself with the condemnation of the atrocities committed by Hamas a year ago. But that said, there is a growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and the restriction on aid is unacceptable. So what more can the international community do to achieve the free movement of aid into Gaza?
Prime Minister.
I addressed this in my statement. We need to get more humanitarian aid in. It's desperately needed. It's been needed for a very, very long time. And that is why we continue to press for that aid to go in, and of course for the protection to go in for those that will then be delivering it once the aid gets in to Gaza that is desperately needed.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the barbaric attack on October the 7th, we've seen an explosion in anti-Semitism and extremism on our streets of our own country. Only on Saturday, we saw people flagrantly valorising Hezbollah in London. We have to root out those who despise our country and our values. What will the Prime Minister do to revoke visas, where appropriate, of those in the UK who are conducting themselves in this manner, to encourage the police to enforce our existing laws without fear or favour, and to further ban and prescribe those organisations, such as the IRGC, which do not support the UK, our values, and the way we wish to conduct ourselves in the world?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question, and we are proud of the democratic right to protest in this country, but supporting a prescribed terrorist group is unacceptable, and we need to be very, very clear about that and give the police our full support in taking the action that they need to take in relation to it, wherever it is in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we mark the anniversary of the horrific Hamas attacks, the subsequent colossal death and destruction, and the ensuing escalation in the region, for anybody in any doubt in the country, Iran is no friend of ours, and indeed is disliked by many of its neighbouring Arab nations for its destabilising activities in the region. And it was abundantly clear to many of us that as soon as Iran came to the aid of its proxy Hezbollah, that Israel's allies would come to its aid to protect it from Iranian missiles. However, it is also extremely frustrating that Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to ignore the international community, the UN Security Council resolutions. Indeed, our own UK Prime Minister, who was one of the first to call for an immediate ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel. And indeed, this UK Parliament, which voted 8 months ago for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So, Prime Minister, how exactly is the UK government going to help bring all sides to the negotiating table and secure peace?
Prime Minister.
Well, his comments about Iran are absolutely right, and we must stand with Israel in the face of the attacks wherever they come from and wherever they are sponsored. And in direct answer to his question, we are working with our allies on de-escalation. We are working with the US in particular on their plan for a ceasefire, because it is only through a ceasefire that we can create the space for the hostages to be safely released, for the aid to get into the region, and a foot in the door for the political solution, a two-state solution, which is the only way to lasting peace.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister spoke quite rightly of the fact that we can barely imagine the pain of both the Israeli families and those in Gaza affected over the past year since that Hamas atrocity. But it's also a pain that's felt acutely in our own communities, by our Jewish communities and our Muslim communities. So can the Prime Minister tell us, since we've had 5,000, a record number of anti-Semitic attacks in this country since that atrocity, what he's going to do to reassure the Jewish and Muslim communities and work with the CST and Tel Mama to strengthen their bonds?
Prime Minister.
She raises a really important point, and we have upped the support to both communities as a result of the dreadful rise in hate crime in all its manifestations in the last year or so, and we will continue to do so, and I know we'll have the support of the House in doing so.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's day of mourning for all those who lost family members on October the 7th and in hostage in tunnels since, for all those civilians in Gaza, the West Bank and now in Lebanon. Like the Prime Minister, I've been meeting hostage families all this last year. The only time they got released was when there was a hostage prisoner deal on the 22nd November last year, where 150 prisoners were released and 50 hostages released. Has the Prime Minister spoken to the Israeli government about another deal to allow the hostages to be released through swapping with political prisoners held in Israeli jails?
Prime Minister.
I accept his point that it's through a cessation of hostilities that the space can be created for the release of hostages. And yes, of course, we talk to leaders, including in Israel, the whole time about how that can be brought about, because it is the central focus of all of our discussions with Israel and with our allies.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's vitally important that on today and every day we remember every single life lost at the hands of Hamas a year ago, every single life who was lost in captivity since, and renew our calls for the release of every single hostage. And whilst I totally agree with the Prime Minister when he says that Israel must have that right to defend herself, some of the decisions he has taken has led to a feeling that this government has stepped back its support for Israel, not least in the restoration of the funding of UNRWA. Does the Prime Minister regret that, and will he revisit that decision so that actions marry up with words?
Prime Minister.
No, there's been no stepping back of support for Israel. We've been absolutely robust in that support, and I've expressed it many, many times in different places, including to the Prime Minister of Israel, and we will continue to support Israel. We'll continue to support Israel's right to defend herself. I think this House is at its best when it speaks with one voice.
Mohammed Yazid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been a year of profound suffering, darkness and trauma. Tens of thousands of innocent people have been killed and displaced. Yet the world has learned nothing. The prospect of two-state solution is a distant dream, and the odds of all-out war in the Middle East is growing by the day. The unimaginable devastation has to stop. The only hope is a diplomatic solution. So can the Prime Minister show me today that the government is doing everything in its power to bring about an immediate and permanent ceasefire across the region?
Yes, and we are not doing it alone. We're working with our allies in relation to it. I spoke to G7 allies last week about it. We speak constantly to the US about it because we need to de-escalate across the region. We've seen escalation in recent days and weeks, and all sides need to pull back from the brink.
Ali Chan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Green Party, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks made by the Prime Minister and others in this House today in remembrance of all those who lost their lives and were taken hostage in the horrific terrorist acts on October 7th last year. One of those was Haim Katzman, murdered by Hamas in Kibbutz Hulit, and whose brother Noy has had his words included in a collection of speeches and eulogies published today by Standing Together. Noy says this of Haim: "I have no doubt that, even in the face of Hamas's people that murdered him, in the face of their extreme right-wing beliefs, he would still call out against killing and violence of innocent people. Here, too, he would be empathetic to pain and oppression." These are powerful words, and in this spirit, I'd like to express my continued and deep concern at the disproportionate response of Israel to the attacks on October the 7th and the extent to which that has perpetuated pain, oppression and the killing of innocent people. In recent days, this response has resulted in an escalation of deadly violence. I welcome the Prime Minister's words today about commitment to de-escalation. Does he agree that an urgent ceasefire both between Israel and Hezbollah and between Israel in Gaza is essential to resolve the conflict?
Well, she read out some very powerful words, which I think will have been heard across the House. And yes, de-escalation is absolutely needed at the moment as the region stands on the brink.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I associate myself with your own words and those of the Prime Minister in opening his statement today. In any time of conflict, our focus must be on two things: de-escalation and peace, and on the plight of the civilian population, whether they be those hostages kidnapped on the 7th of October, whether they be those in Lebanon now sheltering in the street, or whether they be those in Gaza who seek to find health facilities to treat their loved ones and themselves when they suffer from attacks by Israel. What more can we do to support the health service in Lebanon, which is now on its knees and which really does need our support if it is to help the people of Lebanon?
We do need to help and assist with the health services in Lebanon, and along with the other humanitarian support that we're putting in, along with the support we're putting in relation to training and other matters. It's so important that we do so, and we are in constant contact with the Lebanese authorities in relation to that.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of us have been fortunate enough to see the very good work that UNRWA has done on the ground over many years. But to be effective, an aid delivery vehicle does need to be rigorously impartial. Given that, will the government treat with UNRWA with caution and carefully, and remember that other aid delivery agencies are available?
Prime Minister.
Look, of course we have to be careful and make sure that any agency absolutely complies with law, international law, and whether any allegations they're properly investigated and any wrongdoing is rooted out. We do have to provide or help to provide aid across the region, but it is caveated by the first part of my statement in relation to the point that he rightly raises.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to put on record my sorrow at the appallingly violent events of the 7th of October 1 year ago in southern Israel, and for all the days of violence we've witnessed since. Mr. Speaker, since the House last met, the forced displacement of almost 2 million residents of Gaza by Israel's military action has been compounded by a further 500,000 forcibly displaced in Lebanon, again by Israeli military action. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he share the concerns of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, that the Israeli invasion in destroying civilian infrastructure, killing civilians and impacting humanitarian operations is a breach of international law, and what further steps will he take to enforce a ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm not going to accept invitations to agree with other people's assessments. I'll make my own. I've been absolutely clear that Israel has the right to defend herself in accordance with international law. The displacement is a very serious issue across the region. Very many people have been displaced. Many of them simply want to go home. That includes Israelis as well, who've been displaced from their homes. And that is why we need to de-escalate, to ensure that those displaced can return back and live safely in their own communities.
Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In just 15 months, Iran will be free of many of its restrictions in its production of centrifuges and uranium enrichment under the JCPOA. Given the new nexus of evil of North Korea, Iran and Russia on nuclear technology transfer, does the Prime Minister believe the JCPOA is still fit for purpose?
Prime Minister.
He raises a really important point in relation to the nuclear ambitions that we absolutely have to be alive to and make sure that Iran cannot possibly get weapons, and the sanctions and the regime around that has to be geared towards that central issue.
Debbie Abrahams.
My heartfelt sympathies to the families who lost loved ones in the terror attack a year ago today, as well as those who have loved ones that are held in captivity at the moment. And I would also like to do the same for ordinary Palestinian civilians who have lost loved ones in the violence of the last year. It's quite clear that in today's heightened tension across the region, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the Lebanon is not possible. So will the Prime Minister share with us, he's talked about a roadmap, will he share with us what the steps are towards this peace process and the immediate ceasefire that is desperately needed in the region?
I accept that an immediate ceasefire is difficult. I do not accept that it's impossible. And the US and Qatar are working hard on this and have our full support in the action that they are taking, because the reason the US are leading on this is because they well understand the importance of a ceasefire to create the space for all of the other relief that needs to be provided, and of course for the hostages to be released.
Daisy Cooper.
This House knows that when events unfold abroad, they often reverberate on our streets here at home. Despite the trauma of the last 12 months, I'm incredibly proud that in St Albans, the rabbis, our imams and other religious leaders have worked hand in glove to make a bold statement called 5 Principles for Dialogue, Why Jews and Muslims Refuse to Hate Each Other. And they've taken that statement into our primary schools, into our secondary schools and into community forums as well. It's had a very profound effect in my community. Can I ask the Prime Minister, is the relevant government department actively seeking out examples of initiatives like this in order to build, or when necessary rebuild, interfaith dialogue and community cohesion right across the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Yes, because I think it's really important that joint work and some of the interfaith work that was done before October the 7th didn't have the resilience that many of us thought and hoped it would have. Rebuilding it is hard, but should be supported wherever it takes place. And I was interested to hear the particular example that she referred to.
Up to Sam Mohammed.
I thank the Prime Minister for his comments. My thoughts and prayers are with all of those affected by the violence and war over the past year. Human rights and international law apply equally and without favour. All lives matter, Palestinian, Israeli and Lebanese. When breaches of international law are committed, then they should be condemned equally. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that a ceasefire in Gaza is the best way to de-escalate violence? And will he give assurances that this government will do all it can to support diplomatic measures, keep an open review on arms sales? And does he agree that we must at all costs avoid getting involved in a Middle Eastern war which could have catastrophic consequences both here and abroad?
Prime Minister.
We are working constantly with our allies to de-escalate the situation, to hold those responsible to account, and to ensure that we bring about the much sought-after peace that all communities want.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as the terrible loss of life of Israeli, Palestinian and Lebanese citizens, a shocking number of journalists have been killed or wounded while covering events in the Middle East. Will he pay tribute to the courage of journalists who are risking their lives daily simply to do their job? And will he re-emphasise the importance of protecting and respecting all media workers who are covering conflict?
Prime Minister.
Yes and yes. It's a very important point. Journalists, those working in the media, are risking their lives in order to ensure that the rest of us have information about what's going on the ground. Too many have lost their lives, and we must respect that and pay tribute to the really important work that they do. And I am grateful to him for raising a really important issue.
John MacDonald.
Today is a day of sombre remembrance of the suffering on all sides. But if the threat of a war against Iran takes place, we will need to revisit that discussion within this chamber. But I'm pleased that the Prime Minister has rightfully demonstrated that our concern about the suffering on all sides, and particularly mentioned the suffering of children. When the Ukraine war took place, we set up the scheme for the evacuation of children who were seriously injured in Ukraine to come here for treatment. In January, I raised the prospect of that scheme being introduced for Palestinian children and others. Raised it again in May. Wrote to my honourable friend and the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary in July. I wrote again in August and I wrote again in September. There doesn't seem to be any progress on developing such a scheme, despite the willingness of clinicians here. Could the Prime Minister look at that and how we can achieve progress?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for that, and he's right to emphasise the impact this has on children in particular, and we do have special responsibilities in relation to children in any conflict. The first step to protecting children is to create the conditions for a ceasefire, is to de-escalate, which is why, working with our allies, we are spending so much time on that de-escalation and finding a route through to a ceasefire.
Altos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In February this year, I stood in the wreckage of some of the kibbutzim where the atrocities took place on the 7th of October, and I was struck then by the families who we met and their desire for peace rather than revenge. And since then, I'm afraid to say that I've heard minister after minister stand at the dispatch box and mouth the words of peace and de-escalation, and yet the situation has got worse and worse and worse. So my question to the Prime Minister is this: how many more people will have to die before we realise that talking is not enough and that we have to take action with our partners to compel a ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
I think what happens at the dispatch box is the reporting back of the action that we're taking elsewhere. That's under this government and under the last government. And we're not at the dispatch box. We are working with our allies to bring about the ceasefire. I accept it's difficult. I accept it has not yet happened. I refuse to give up on the idea that through diplomacy we can reach that de-escalation and ceasefire, and we will continue to work with our allies to do so. I think what we've tried to do, particularly in recent weeks, is to coordinate with our allies so that we speak and take action in one coordinated way, which for me is more powerful than each nation taking action separately.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the words of honourable and right honourable members today and add my thoughts to the families and hostages that were taken a year ago, and I too hope for their safe return. Mr. Speaker, latest figures suggest there are approximately 6,000 Lebanese nationals in the UK with a temporary right to remain. Lebanese nationals in Edinburgh have recounted to me their fears about returning home and their concerns about the inevitable humanitarian crisis that will follow should the conflict continue. Can I ask my right honourable friend if the government will commit to looking at options to ensure no Lebanese national currently in the UK is forced to return to Lebanon during this current conflict?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I can give that assurance, and it's very important. We need to get British nationals who are in Lebanon out of Lebanon as quickly and as safely as possible, and we certainly shouldn't be returning people back to the conflict zone whilst the conflict is going on.
Ben Lake.
Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary delivered important statements at the UN last month, emphasising the importance of upholding both the principles and the purposes of the UN Charter as a foundation for rules-based international order. The PM rightly states today that a political settlement is the only route to a lasting peace and stability in the region. In working towards that aim, what consideration is his government giving to official recognition of Palestinian statehood?
Prime Minister.
The question of recognition is a question of when, not if. Well, at the point of greatest impact, we do need a two-state solution. We need to work with our allies towards that end, and we will continue to do so because this conflict will not de-escalate until there's a political route through.
Afsana Begum.
It is with profound sadness that we take stock of the past year, in which 1,200 Israelis were killed by Hamas's horrific attack, and over 41,000 Palestinians and thousands in Lebanon that have been killed by the Israeli military onslaught. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that all lives should be cherished, Israeli, Palestinian and Lebanese, and that nothing can ever justify the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and will he join me in calling for a ceasefire and accountability in the region of the Middle East?
Prime Minister.
I certainly agree that all lives should be cherished, and I think that is the position across the House. As I've said, de-escalation and a ceasefire is the only way forward, which is why we're working so hard on it.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I welcome the Prime Minister's call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, there is so much more he can do to bring that about. As South Africa's Foreign Minister said, the decision to stop the fighting in Gaza is in the hands of those who supply Israel with weapons. And he knows that international law does not differentiate between offensive weapons and defensive weapons. So why does he continue to licence 90% of weapon sales to Israel when there is ample proof that UK weapons are still being used to prolong this catastrophe?
Prime Minister.
For the reason I've twice stated, if sale of weapons for defensive use by Israel were banned, that is a position that I could not countenance a year after October the 7th. It's not a position I could countenance in the face of attacks by Iran. The whole House saw the number of missiles coming over into Israel only the other day. And the idea that we could say we support Israel's right to defend herself and at the same time deprive her of the means to do so is so wholly inconsistent that it will never be my position.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scale of the devastation that we have seen in the Middle East is appalling, including, in recent weeks, 127 innocent children killed in Lebanon. The scale of death is appalling, and the potential for further escalation is terrifying. Can the Prime Minister tell the House how he is working with his fellow world leaders to push for de-escalation and a peaceful settlement?
Prime Minister.
Yes, we are working with our colleagues and our allies constantly, whether that's through the G7, whether that's on bilaterally, a numerous daily contact on this to bring about the de-escalation that is so desperately needed.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hezbollah began its latest assault on Israel on 8th of October, the day after Hamas's attacks on Israel. The Iran-backed terror group has fired over 12,000 rockets towards Israel over the past year, yet the international community only called for a ceasefire after Israel responded. Now, the Prime Minister said he's committed to standing by Israel against the threats it faces, but will he deliver on his commitment to prescribe Iran's IRGC?
Prime Minister.
Well, in relation to the IRGC, I gave an answer earlier on in relation to that. We do need to address state threats, and we're looking at how we can do that, and we'll continue to do so.
Linda Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister has said, the horrific Hamas attacks 1 year ago inflicted unbearable pain and loss on Israeli civilians, and we continue to condemn these attacks in the strongest terms. I remember clearly too the fear that my then colleagues in Gaza, Palestinian aid workers, felt as bombs began dropping on them that night. The healthcare system in Gaza is now all but destroyed, and according to the UN, there have been 36 recent attacks on healthcare facilities in Lebanon. Israeli forces are also now using fighter jets to bomb refugee camps in the West Bank. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is unacceptable? And as he will be aware, the UK Government is the UN Security Council lead on the protection of civilians. Next month, when the UK has the UN Security Council presidency, will he ensure a focus on the protection of civilians?
Prime Minister.
Well, she speaks with great experience, and yes, we need aid into the region, and we need to protect aid workers, because that is the only way that the aid can get where it is needed.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And today we mark that terrible anniversary of the biggest slaughter of Jews since the Second World War. And we must also note that since that day, over 60,000 Israelis have been displaced in northern Israel by the actions of Hezbollah. Therefore, the Israeli government's had no choice but to mobilise the IDF, and any Israeli citizen has to do that. Yesterday in Leeds, I'm very proud that the city had a multi-faith remembrance service in Millennium Square, over 1,000 people. And does the Prime Minister agree that that's in marked contrast to the individual who drove out into hiding the Jewish chaplain of Leeds because he had to serve as a member of the IDF because he's an Israeli citizen? Is that not a pure act of hatred and anti-Semitism?
Prime Minister.
We must hunt that hatred out wherever we see it, and he's quite right to raise it and to call it out. We must also focus on the multi-faith work, and he referenced that, and I think across the House we want to see more of it. And he's absolutely right about the displacement in northern Israel. Many families simply wanting to return to their homes, both sides of the border, but we must never forget the impact it has on them.
Nigel Kelliscan.
Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement at what is a sombering day as we reflect on the past year, the atrocities of the 7th of October, and of course the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and now in Lebanon. In my constituency of Barking, I have communities that have links to Israel, to Gaza, to Palestine and also to Lebanon, and they regularly raise with me the need for an immediate ceasefire. Does the Prime Minister recognise that ceasefire is a critical step in what in the end can be the only solution, which is a political solution for the region?
Yes, and that's why we're working with allies, including the US, on seeking to bring it about.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. 1,200 butchered, 250 plus hostages taken, over 100 of whom are still there, including Emily Damari, a 28-year-old British citizen. Can the Prime Minister recommit today to do whatever it takes to leave no stone unturned in ensuring that she is returned to her family and that, if necessary, British assets are used to help extract her?
Prime Minister.
Yes, absolutely, and that is the commitment I gave to her mother and the other families that I met last week and then on various other occasions before that. I've sat with her mother and seen firsthand the utter agony that she is going through, as any parent would in those circumstances. And I gave her that commitment. I repeat it here.
Alex Burrell-Curtis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and associate myself with the clear calls for unimpeded access to aid, immediate ceasefire and an immediate return of the hostages. But since this heinous terrorist attack 1 year ago, we have seen here at home a consequential increase in the crimes of hate, anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. I know his commitment to tackling the scourge of such hatred. I've seen it up close. So will he assure me that his government will continue to challenge all such forms of hatred, both here and abroad?
Prime Minister.
Yes, absolutely. We can and we must. And I think across the House, we all know the impact of hate crime. We've all been horrified by the increase over the last 12 months, and we have a duty and a responsibility to do everything we can to reduce it, and we will work with others to do so.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I also join the Prime Minister in offering my condolences to the families of all those killed and continue to be killed. I also join the Prime Minister in relation to release of hostages, and all hostages, including those children that are held in the Israeli detention centres without charge and without any legal representation. Given what the Prime Minister said in relation to self-defence, when it's in itself is a moot point, is this Prime Minister stating to this House that all offensive weapons are banned and it's just defensive weapons that are being supplied?
He will well know the legal framework that we have, the domestic legislation in place that was passed and applied by successive governments and our international obligations. We've taken our decisions against that legislation in accordance with that legislation, as the House would expect, and we have published a summary of our reasons for doing so for the House to examine.
Johnny Ward.
You don't know.
Condolences to all those affected by the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October. And can I also thank the Prime Minister for his statement today. Can I ask the Prime Minister if he agrees with me that the sharp rise in anti-Semitism that we've seen since the 7th of October, actually now reaching the highest ever recorded in the UK, is a stain on our democracy? And can I ask him to pass his reassurances to the Jewish communities across the UK that his government's doing everything it can to ensure their security and safety and to tackle this scourge of anti-Semitism?
Let me give that reassurance. I think we are all shocked by the sharp rise in anti-Semitism. We need to work with all communities to bring that down in relation to hate crime, whichever community it is aimed at, whether it's the Jewish community, Muslim community or any other community.
Joy Morris.
May I thank the Prime Minister for clarifying the government's position on Israel's right to defend itself. And will the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary clarify to this House what steps are being taken to tackle violent disorder and anti-Semitism in London? Many people in many British Jewish communities here in London feel under threat. Particularly this weekend, we saw violent protests. What is the government going to do to tackle that and to make our British Jewish communities feel safe again?
We have to support the right to freedom of protest, but at the same time be absolutely clear in relation to terrorist organisations and support for terrorist organisations that is not to be tolerated, and we will work with the police and other law enforcement to ensure that we tackle it and stand very, very firm on it.
Just silence.
Matthew. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, as with so many times in the history of the Jewish people, we are bound in grief and in mourning. Would the Prime Minister assure the Jewish community that we are not alone in that grief? And would he take this opportunity to join me in praising the dignity, the courage and the love shown by the families and friends
of the hostages in their efforts to bring them home?
Let me give that assurance that they're not alone, and let me pay tribute again to the families. It is incredibly moving to spend any time with them and to hear firsthand what they are going through. And as I've said to them every time I've met them, the impact it has, I think, on anybody listening to it, the impact it has on me is profound.
Iqbal Mohammed Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I join the Prime Minister and the House in offering my condolences to the families of all those Israeli civilians killed on October the 7th and all innocent civilians, Israeli, Palestinian, Lebanese or other, over the last 12 months. Over the last 12 months, over 950 Palestinian bloodlines have been wiped off the face of the earth. No family member remains from those generations. Over 1,000 families have only one sole survivor remaining, living today. What message does the Prime Minister have for the British Palestinians and the surviving Palestinians in the affected region, and what is he doing to protect them from the same fate as the 42,000 and counting?
There's been far too much bloodshed and killing, far too many children orphaned, and I give my assurance that we will do everything we can, and we are doing everything we can, to de-escalate, to bring about the ceasefire, to allow much-needed aid to go in, hostages to come out. But I absolutely understand the strength of the point that he puts to me.
Andrew George.
The Prime Minister says that I stand with Israel, I stand with peace, I stand with the Israeli people, and I stand with the Palestinians and the Lebanese equally. But this isn't mere semantics. I applaud that the military from the UK were involved in it, protecting Israelis at the weekend. But where is the equivalence for the people of Gaza and of Beirut and elsewhere?
In the work that we're doing to bring about de-escalation and a ceasefire, because that is the only route through. That is why we're working with our allies so closely on those issues, and we'll continue to do so.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The tragedy of the deaths a year ago have now been compounded by tens of thousands more deaths in Gaza, the West Bank, and in Lebanon. Gaza is now reduced to a place of rubble and famine and thirst and premature death, and lots of children looking for their families. The bombs that have rained down on Gaza and other places are in part supplied by this country. The International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have both made very strong opinions on the whole situation there. Will the Prime Minister revisit the whole situation of the sale of British arms that are being used to bomb Gaza and kill wholly innocent Palestinian civilians?
We've set out our position that domestic law is clear, international law is clear, and we've taken our decision and put a summary of that before the House.